Tomorrow Boris Johnson's going to try and push through his plans for an early election in December. How will you be voting?
I shall be voting against it. This is not the time to be holding a general election. It's a time for cool heads and grown-up government. Parliament has indicated clearly that it is willing to support this deal. The Prime Minister said he wants the deal. These deadlines, 31st of October, are meaningless. The key thing now is to get the deal properly scrutinised in Parliament. That doesn't mean delaying it by months. It means giving Parliament a few days, a couple of weeks, to scrutinise the bill, amend it if necessary, and then we can make progress. And the government should stop making threats, stop throwing tantrums, and get on with the grown-up business of doing its business. Just because it can't get exactly what it wants doesn't mean that it should stop working.
You say it's a time for grown-up government. I assume you don't think that's what we have right now, then?
Well, this approach of, the government will say what it wants, and if it doesn't get it, it will simply stop. It won't engage with the reality, is not grown up. The government doesn't have a majority in Parliament, and any government owes its legitimacy to Parliament, and it has to trim to the clearly expressed will of Parliament. Now, Parliament has made it clear that it will support the Prime Minister's deal. But, of course, there will be amendments that will be moved during the course of the consideration of the bill. Some of them will simply improve Parliament's control of the next stage of the process. Some of them will be much more challenging for the government, and some of them the government would feel very strongly opposed to. But that's not a reason for not considering them. I'm
interested to know your views on some of the amendments that might be attached to the legislation. But just to kind of finish off on the election business, I assume that you won't be backing the Lib Dem and SNP call to try and get an election by December the 9th either in this case.
No, it's the same point. We've got to solve the Brexit problem, and then of course, we will have to have a general election in due course.
And when we do have that election, are you still hoping to stand as a Conservative candidate?
Well, at the moment, that's not possible because I don't have the Conservative whip, and I am not going to change what I say and what I believe and what I think about is important for Britain's future in any kind of attempt to sort of sneak back in and curry favour with the Conservative leadership. I hope that the party leadership would recognise in due course that abandoning the concept of a broad church Conservative party that embraces people that have a wide range of views, abandoning that would be electorally very damaging, but I'm not holding my breath. So
would you run as an independent then if you aren't offered a way back into the party?
That's my intention, yes.
OK. Now, let's talk about the bill, because it's pretty clear that you want to get that withdrawal agreement bill back on the table, really scrutinise it. But would you vote for it and continue to vote for it as it currently stands?
No, I think that I voted for it at second reading. We now need a sensible timetable motion. So we have, let's say, 4 days to scrutinise it in the Commons in committee. By the way, if the government had pressed on with this last week, we could virtually have completed that process by now. I want to see parliamentary oversight of the next stage of negotiation strengthened. Because let's be very clear, the so-called deal that Boris has presented represents a final solution only for 2% of the UK's population, the 2% that live in Northern Ireland. For the other 98%, we'll be left dangling, not knowing whether we're going to end up with a real deal with the European Union or whether we're going to effectively be in a no-deal situation at the end of 2020. That's just more uncertainty for business and for people as they go about their day-to-day affairs. So what we need to do is strengthen parliamentary control of the process. Now, that's not a guarantee of anything, of course. The next Parliament may have a clear majority for a hard Brexit, in which case that's what it will pursue. That's how democracy works. But we can at least ensure that Parliament, not the government, has control of that process.
I mean, there's likely to be several amendments to the bill, not least one for a second referendum. I remember the last time that I interviewed you, have a quick look at what you said, I think, about a second referendum.
I said it's a credible option.
Yes, you said it's a perfectly coherent position. Many people will be strongly opposed to it, but it is a coherent position and it deserves to be considered. So would you back an amendment for a second referendum?
Probably not. So saying that it's a coherent proposition that deserves to be considered is not the same as saying I would back it. I have long said that the only way we're going to solve the crisis in our society and our politics that Brexit has created is by a compromise, a deal which represents a bit of give and take between the Leave and the Remain sides of the argument. A referendum just asks the question again between two binary outcomes, and even if the numbers move, will leave a very large proportion of the population feeling that they've lost out and don't have a stake in Britain's future. So I don't think repeating the question is the right way forward. I think a compromise deal is the right way forward. And
could that include a customs union, for example? That's another amendment that could very well be put. Would that be the kind of compromise that you could support?
Yes, I could support a customs union. Customs union would overcome the problem that there are two problems at the centre of this deal. The first one is that it splits Northern Ireland from the rest of the United Kingdom. If the whole of the United Kingdom was in a customs union, then the whole of the United Kingdom would be treated the same, and the threat to the union with Northern Ireland would be gone. And the second big challenge with this deal is that it clearly could be a route to a no-deal exit at the end of 2020. And we've got to rule that out. People like me have been saying from the very beginning, what we're focused on is making sure that we avoid a no-deal exit. And that applies as much to a no-deal exit in December 2020 as it does to a no-deal exit in October 2019.
At the same time, though, many of our viewers listening to this will be like, look, we always hear this from MPs, that they just want to stop no deal. But at the same time, what MPs are trying to do is to just bog everything down, to be in this Brexit purgatory until Brexit just doesn't happen at all. I mean, we've just missed successive deadlines. And MPs have to take some responsibility for this as well, don't they?
Well, look, the deadline, the so-called deadline next Thursday, as Nicky Morgan has just said, wasn't decided by anybody in the UK, wasn't voted on here. It was imposed by the European Union. It's a totally arbitrary date. Of course, we've got to get this resolved now as soon as we possibly can, and we need to resolve it by a deal which takes us out of the European Union so that we're done with membership of the Union, and that's a big win for those that want to leave the European Union, but a deal that also ensures that our economy will remain closely aligned with our biggest market and our biggest customer, and that is a win of sorts for those who wanted to remain, so that we can go forward with some kind of compromise that allows this country to come back together and be a success in the future.
You just said that the 31st is an arbitrary deadline. It looks like we are staring another extension in the face. I mean, you, of course, have had conversations with many people in the EU, in Brussels. What's your sense about how long that extension could be?
Well, we mandated the Prime Minister to ask for a 3-month extension to the 31st of January, and we did that on the basis of our best assessment of what was the right balance between views at home and views in Europe about what an extension could look like. I think 31st of January is the right answer, and probably the answer that the European Union will give, but I'm sure they will make it very clear that if we get a deal done and ratified before then, even if we get a deal done in November, then that extension can be brought to an end very quickly, possibly within days, so that an end of November exit is a perfectly feasible proposition if the government just stops messing about, tables a sensible timetable tomorrow for consideration of the bill, a timetable that would give us perhaps a week or so in the Commons, and then the House of Lords will need a couple of weeks, and then we can get this done. You
say the government's messing about, but I just wonder if actually Boris Johnson deserves a little bit more credit than some people are giving him. I mean, many people said he was never going to be able to negotiate a Brexit deal in the time, and yet he has. He's come back with a deal. He's got it closer than Theresa May ever did to getting a majority in the House of Commons. Surely it's now time for you to step back and say, fair enough, I underestimated you.
Well, look, I've never underestimated Boris's skill as a political operator, and I've said that consistently, that he may be able to do things that his predecessor was unable to do because he's a very slick political operator. But the deal that Boris has done is a deal that was available to Theresa May 15 months ago, a deal that would have split Northern Ireland from the rest of the UK. Theresa May rejected that. Boris agreed with her at the time that that was not something any British Prime Minister could agree. He said as recently as September the 11th that a Northern Ireland-only backstop would be completely unacceptable to the UK. So pivoting to accept something that's previously been on offer from the EU, it was their preferred solution and has been rejected because it didn't work for the UK, is an achievement maybe, but a limited achievement, I think. So he's put that on the table now, and people will want to look very carefully at the detail of how it works. But Parliament has clearly signalled that it is willing to get to work on this bill.
So does this deal damage the union?
Potentially it does. I say potentially because if the UK has a very close relationship with the EU, at quota-free, tariff-free trade, alignment of regulations, for example, then that means that trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland will flow freely and without any interruptions, any complications. But if we have a different relationship, a WTO relationship with the EU, then there will be a hard border between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and that would be extremely damaging to the Union.
Just finally, kind of in the past, I think people saw you as a bit of a classic Conservative, you know, kind of Eurosceptic, Chancellor, former Foreign Secretary, and now you have morphed into a rebel. So I'm just trying to work out how are you finding life now as a kind of troublesome backbencher?
Well, look, I haven't changed my position. What's happened is that the government that I desperately want to support has changed its view and is now presenting a deal which could head to a no-deal WTO outcome at the end of 2020. And that's something I am very clear we must avoid for the sake of our economy and for the sake of the United Kingdom. So I will do what I have to do and say what I have to say. It's not a comfortable position. I'm not a natural rebel. I want to be a part of the Conservative family, a party I've belonged to for 45 years. And I would very much hope the Conservative Party does eventually decide that it wants to remain a broad church and it wants to have space for people with my views as well as people with Ian Duncan Smith's views within the same party.